June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto read the message twice before lowering the paper. The flagship of the combined fleet lay at anchor, massive and immaculate, the pride of Imperial Japan. Outside his cabin, officers moved with rehearsed calm. Inside, Yamamoto felt the war shift beneath his feet. The report was short, brutally precise. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been lost near a tiny atoll called Midway. For a long moment, Yamamoto said nothing. He had warned them. Years earlier, after studying in the United States, he had told Japan's leaders that war with America would not be won by spirit alone. Japan could strike hard, but only once. Midway was meant to be that decisive blow, the final destruction of American carrier power. Instead, it had become a disaster beyond imagination. The losses were not just steel and aircraft. They were men, elite pilots trained over a decade, burned alive in hangar decks flooded with aviation fuel. Japan's naval air arm, the sharpest blade in the Empire's arsenal, had been shattered in a single morning. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, later recorded the silence that followed. No outburst, no denial, only the quiet realization that something irreversible had occurred. Yamamoto accepted responsibility immediately. The plan had been his, complex, ambitious, and fatally overconfident. Far across the Pacific, American sailors were already calling Midway a miracle. In Japan, it would be called nothing at all. The public would never know the scale of the loss. But within the Navy, the truth spread with terrifying speed. This was not a setback. It was a turning point. As the sun set over the inland sea, Yamamoto ordered the remaining forces to withdraw. There would be no heroic counterattack, no dramatic recovery. Japan would continue the war, but now from a position of weakness it could never fully escape. And as the Admiral stared once more at the charts, a question hung unspoken in the room. What would Japan become now that its illusion of invincibility was gone? June 6, 1942. Admiral Chūichi Nagumo stood on the bridge just before dawn, watching the horizon where smoke had once marked the presence of his carriers. Now there was nothing, only open sea and the low, rhythmic sound of engines pulling the remnants of his force westward. Nagumo had not slept. Less than 48 hours earlier, he had commanded the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. Now 3 of his 4 carriers lay on the ocean floor, and the 4th had been lost after a final, futile counterstrike. The Admiral's face remained composed, but those close to him noticed the tremor in his hands. He understood what awaited him in Japan. In the Imperial Navy, defeat was not forgiven easily, especially when silence could not hide the scale of the catastrophe. Survivor reports filtered in throughout the morning. Pilots described bombs tearing through flight decks as planes sat fully armed. Damage control teams suffocated in smoke-filled compartments. One officer recalled seeing the Akagi's bridge engulfed in flame. The flagship of Pearl Harbor reduced to a burning wreck within minutes. Nagumo said little as he read each account. The decisions that led here replayed endlessly in his mind. The delayed strike, the rearming order reversed too late. The moment American dive bombers appeared out of the sun, history would judge those minutes harshly. But on that bridge, there was no argument left to make. The outcome was already written in the water behind them. In Tokyo, Naval Headquarters received the first full casualty estimates on June 6. Senior officers stared at the numbers in disbelief. Over 3,000 men gone, carrier divisions erased. Years of planning undone by an enemy they had believed inferior. One staff officer reportedly whispered, "We have lost the war," before catching himself and falling silent. Officially, the battle would be described as a partial success. Midway Island, they claimed, had been damaged. The fleet had withdrawn by choice. But among the admirals, there was no illusion. They knew the Americans still had carriers, and Japan no longer did. As Nagumo's battered task force disappeared into the western horizon, the weight of Midway followed him home. He was still an admiral, still alive, but the war he returned to would no longer resemble the one he had left. The Empire had crossed a line it could not retreat from. June 7, 1942. The room was sealed, the doors closed to all but the highest-ranking officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Cigarette. Smoke hung heavy in the air as the first comprehensive reports from Midway were read aloud. No reporters, no army observers, only admirals. And the truth. Vice Admiral Osamu Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, listened without expression. When the final casualty numbers were confirmed, even the most seasoned officers felt their composure crack. 4 fleet carriers lost, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, Japan's veteran air crews, men who could not be replaced, gone. For several seconds after the briefing ended, no one spoke. Then someone finally asked the question that mattered most. How did this happen? The answer was as uncomfortable as it was unavoidable. The Americans had known. They had anticipated the attack, positioned their carriers in advance, and struck first. Japan's carefully orchestrated operation, spread across thousands of miles, dependent on perfect timing, had collapsed under its own complexity. One admiral quietly admitted what few dared say openly. Japanese doctrine had failed. The belief that offensive spirit could compensate for intelligence. Gaps and rigid command structures had been shattered off Midway's shores. There was anger, but it had no clear target. Yamamoto was too respected, Nagumo too politically protected, for now. Instead, the frustration turned inward. Officers questioned long-held assumptions that the enemy would behave predictably, that Japan could control the tempo of the war, that decisive victory was still achievable. A junior staff officer later recalled seeing a senior admiral staring at a wall map of the Pacific, his finger tracing the vast distances between Japan and Hawaii. "We are fighting geography itself," the admiral murmured. That same day, strict censorship orders were issued. Newspapers would report a victory. Families would receive carefully worded notices. The nation would be shielded from the truth. But within naval headquarters, the illusion was gone. Midway had not merely destroyed ships, it had destroyed certainty. Every future operation would now be planned under the shadow of American carriers that refused to stay dead. And as the meeting adjourned, one realization lingered among the men who left the room in silence. From this moment forward, Japan would be reacting, not deciding. June 8, 1942, the survivors arrived quietly. Damaged cruisers and destroyers slipped into Truk under heavy security. Their decks scarred, their crews thinned. There were no bands, no speeches, no photographers. Only medical teams and intelligence officers waiting on the piers. The Imperial Navy had lost battles before, but never like this. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi was not among them. He had gone down with Hiryu, refusing rescue after launching his final strike. Among Japanese officers, his death spread quickly, spoken of in low voices. Yamaguchi had been aggressive, brilliant, feared. His loss cut deeper than statistics ever could. Interrogation teams moved through the ships methodically, collecting first-hand accounts. Pilots spoke of confusion, orders changing mid-mission, radio silence, smoke obscuring signals. One aviator described returning from a strike to find his carrier already ablaze. The deck unusable, his only option the sea. He survived. Most did not. Senior officers listened, stone-faced. In private conversations, the tone shifted. Some spoke bitterly of fate. Others blamed American luck. A few, more honest, admitted that Japanese arrogance had played its part. The belief that Midway was already won had dulled caution. Carriers had been caught at their most vulnerable. Aircraft fueled, bombs exposed, decks crowded. That evening, a small group of admirals gathered in Truk's underground command rooms. Maps were spread, but no one pointed. The question was no longer how to defeat America, but how to survive its response. Submarine commanders warned that U.S. shipbuilding capacity was accelerating. Intelligence officers reported increased American carrier activity. The war, once envisioned as a short, violent campaign, was clearly becoming something else entirely. One officer summarized the mood with brutal clarity. "From now on, every loss will matter more to us than to them." Outside, the lagoon was calm, reflecting the stars. The ships rested at anchor, silent witnesses to a navy that had reached its high water mark and passed it without realizing. The men who survived Midway knew it. The men who died there ensured it. And in the quiet of Truk Lagoon, Japan's admirals began, preparing for a war they no longer believed they could end on their own terms. June 10, 1942. The written words were careful, almost elegant, drafted behind closed doors. The official communique to the Japanese public described Midway as an inconclusive engagement. Losses were mentioned vaguely. Heroism was emphasized. Victory somehow was implied. The document passed through multiple hands, each admiral and bureaucrat polishing its language until it no longer resembled the truth. Inside the Navy Ministry, however, the mood was starkly different. Admiral Osamu Nagano met privately with senior staff that afternoon. Voices were low, doors locked. The subject was not Midway itself, but accountability. The question hung unspoken: who would pay for this? Chūichi Nagumo's name surfaced repeatedly. His decisions during the battle were already being dissected in whispered conversations. The delayed launch, the failure to anticipate American carriers. Yet no one moved openly against him. Nagumo was closely tied to the old guard, protected by tradition and seniority. Removing him too quickly risked exposing the depth of the defeat. Instead, the Navy chose silence. Behind the scenes, Yamamoto sent a personal message accepting full responsibility for the operation. It was both honorable and politically necessary. He remained indispensable. No other admiral commanded the same respect or fear among subordinates. Removing him would have shattered morale entirely. Meanwhile, intelligence reports painted a grim picture. American newspapers openly celebrated Midway. New carriers were already under construction. Pilot training programs expanded at a pace Japan could not match. The enemy was not reeling. It was mobilizing. A young staff officer, reviewing intercepted broadcasts, later recalled feeling physically ill. "They speak of Midway as the beginning," he said. "For us, it is the end of something." That night, Nagano reportedly stared long into a glass of sake, barely touching it. He understood the implications better than most. Japan could still fight. It could still win battles, but it had lost the initiative, and with it, the luxury of choosing how the war would be fought. Midway would not be spoken of openly again, but from this moment forward, every Japanese naval decision would be shaped by what had been lost in those burning hours over a tiny Pacific atoll. July 1st, 1942. Nearly a month after Midway, the wounds had not closed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat with his senior commanders in a briefing room overlooking the grey waters of Kure. Summer rain streaked the windows, blurring the outlines of anchored warships beyond. The carriers that once defined Japanese naval power were absent. Their empty berths spoke louder than any report. The meeting's purpose was forward-looking, but Midway dominated every discussion. Yamamoto listened as planners outlined the next phase of the war: defensive perimeters, island airfields, attrition strategies. The language itself had changed. No one spoke of decisive battles anymore. The Navy was preparing to absorb blows rather than deliver them. When Yamamoto finally spoke, his voice was steady but subdued. He acknowledged what everyone in the room already knew. Japan could not replace its carrier aircrews. Training programs were being shortened. Standards lowered. Quantity would replace quality, not by choice, but by necessity. Several admirals exchanged uneasy glances. One officer raised the question of morale. The fleet still believed in Yamamoto, still believed in the Empire, but Midway lingered like a shadow. Survivors had talked. Officers knew what had been lost. The myth of invincibility was gone, and no speech could restore it. Yamamoto addressed this directly. According to notes taken that day, he warned against underestimating the enemy again. "We must assume," he said, "that the Americans will improve faster than we do." It was a remarkable admission in a culture built on confidence and hierarchy. Outside the room, younger officers debated quietly. Some argued for aggressive action. Another gambled to regain momentum. Others urged caution, fearing that one more disaster would be fatal. The Navy stood at a crossroads, unsure whether boldness or restraint offered the better chance of survival. By the meeting's end, one decision was clear: Japan would move south. The Solomon Islands would become the next battleground. A new base at Guadalcanal would extend Japan's reach and test whether the Navy still had teeth. As Yamamoto rose to leave, an aide later recalled his expression, not defeated but burdened. Midway had not broken him, but it had forced him to fight a war he never wanted, under conditions he knew favored the enemy, and the next confrontation was already taking shape. August 7th, 1942, Rabaul, New Britain. The news arrived just after sunrise. American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal. At the Japanese Naval headquarters in Rabaul, officers crowded around radios and map tables as fragmented reports poured in. The island, still under construction, its airfield unfinished, had been seized almost without resistance. For the first time since Midway, the Americans were on the offensive. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, grasped the implications immediately. Guadalcanal was not just another island. If the Americans completed that airfield, they would threaten Japan's entire southern perimeter. Supply routes to Rabaul, the linchpin of Japanese power in the South Pacific, would be exposed. There was no time for deliberation. Mikawa ordered his cruisers and destroyers to prepare for a night attack. No carriers, no air cover. It was a gamble born of desperation and of the lessons of Midway. Surprise, speed, and darkness would have to compensate for everything Japan had lost. That night, Japanese warships slipped through the slot, engines throttled back, crews tense. Many of the officers aboard had survived Midway. They knew what failure looked like now. There was no illusion of invincibility, only the determination not to retreat again. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa struck. The Battle of Savo Island was swift and brutal. Allied cruisers were caught unprepared, their crews asleep, their formations loose. In less than an hour, 4 heavy cruisers were sunk. It was one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. For a moment, the old confidence flickered back to life. But Mikawa did not press on. Fearing daylight air attacks, fear born directly from Midway, he withdrew without attacking the vulnerable transport ships. The Marines remained ashore. Guadalcanal remained contested. In Tokyo and Rabaul alike, the reaction was mixed. Tactical victory, strategic hesitation. The Admirals understood what this meant. Midway had taught them caution, but caution now carried its own price. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, wreckage burned on the water, and both sides prepared for a campaign neither fully understood yet. Japan had proven it could still strike hard, but it had also proven that it no longer dared to finish the job. August 20th, 1942, Truk Lagoon. The first Japanese reinforcements bound for Guadalcanal gathered under strict radio silence. Destroyers loaded with troops and supplies waited in the moonlit lagoon. Their decks crowded, their crews tense. This was not the confident deployment of early 1942. It was a hurried, improvised effort, what officers were already calling the Tokyo Express. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, a veteran destroyer commander, understood the risks better than most. Daylight was now lethal. American aircraft, operating from the newly captured Henderson Field, dominated the skies. Every movement had to be made at night, every delivery rushed, incomplete, uncertain. Tanaka reportedly told one subordinate, "This is not how a great navy fights, but it is how we must fight now." Within the naval staff, Guadalcanal reopened old Midway wounds. Carrier support was scarce. Fuel was limited. Pilot quality was already declining. Each resupply run felt like rolling dice weighted against Japan. Admiral Yamamoto watched the situation closely from Combined Fleet headquarters. He approved aggressive action, but with restrictions that frustrated field commanders. No daylight carrier risks, no reckless exposure. Midway had burned those lessons into him. Meanwhile, the men on Guadalcanal began to starve. Supplies lost at sea. Food spoiled. Ammunition ran low. Army officers on the island sent increasingly desperate messages, blaming the Navy for their situation. Inter-service resentment, long suppressed, flared into open hostility. Midway had not just weakened Japan militarily, it had fractured its unity. One naval officer later recalled a grim joke circulating in Truk. "The Americans bring hamburgers by day. We bring rice by night if we survive." By late August, Japanese commanders faced an impossible choice. Commit carriers again and risk another Midway, or continue this slow, grinding struggle that bled the army white. On August 24th, Yamamoto authorized limited carrier action near the Eastern Solomons. It was cautious, calculated, nothing like the bold strokes of 6 months earlier. The battle that followed would prove something unsettling. Japan could still fight, but it no longer controlled the terms. And beneath every order, every hesitation, the memory of Midway lingered, shaping decisions through fear as much as strategy. August 25, 1942, after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The reports arrived in fragments, just as they had at Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received them aboard his headquarters ship with practiced calm. One Japanese light carrier, Ryujo, sunk. Aircraft losses heavy. American carriers damaged, but still afloat, still operational. Another engagement where Japan struck first, fought hard, and yet failed to change the strategic picture. This time, there was no shock. Yamamoto understood immediately what Eastern Solomons meant. Japan could no longer absorb losses, even in successful battles. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every damaged carrier took months to repair, time Japan did not have. Among the carrier commanders, toggle conversations turned somber. One officer remarked that American pilots seemed younger, less experienced, but there were always more of them. The United States was learning quickly, adapting tactics, improving coordination. The advantage Japan had nurtured for years was evaporating in real time. In Tokyo, naval planners compared Midway and Eastern Solomons side by side. The pattern was undeniable. The Americans were no longer reacting. They were dictating tempo, forcing Japan to respond on unfavorable terms. Vice Admiral Nagumo, sidelined but not forgotten, reportedly followed the battle reports closely. To some, Eastern Solomons felt like his vindication, proof that even cautious carrier operations now carried unacceptable risk. To others, it was further evidence that the Navy had lost its nerve. Within the ranks, the language shifted again. Officers spoke of endurance instead of victory, of holding lines instead of breaking them. Midway had been the wound. Guadalcanal was the slow bleed. One senior admiral confided to a colleague, "We are fighting to avoid defeat, not to achieve success." As September approached, Japan's admirals faced a grim reality. Guadalcanal could not be abandoned without strategic collapse. But holding it meant pouring men and ships into a battle of attrition. The empire was not built to win, and looming ahead was a confrontation that would test Japan's navy as never before, a decisive surface battle fought in darkness. Desperation and fading hope. November 15, 1942, Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal campaign. By mid-November, the Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self in the Solomons. The months since Midway had transformed every calculation, every command, and every risk into a delicate negotiation with reality. Fuel was scarce, pilots were exhausted, and ships bore the scars of repeated engagements. Yet the admirals remained determined to hold the line. Driven as much by honor as by strategy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, observing the reports from headquarters, could see the cumulative effect of Midway reverberating through every decision. There were no more opportunities for bold, decisive strikes. Every engagement now demanded caution. Every maneuver was weighed against the inexorable reality that Japan no longer controlled the initiative. At sea, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa prepared his forces for another night engagement. The Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and limited carrier support were ready to challenge the Americans. But the calculus had changed. Where once audacity could secure a victory, now audacity risked annihilation. Midway's lessons, seared into every officer's mind, demanded restraint, and yet restraint brought its own peril. The ensuing naval battles, like the infamous naval Battle of Guadalcanal, were fierce but inconclusive. Japanese forces inflicted damage, but the Americans held the island. Yamamoto and his admirals watched in grim silence. Each loss, each missed opportunity, reinforced the painful truth that Japan's strategic advantage had evaporated in the Pacific. Back in Tokyo, the truth was carefully concealed from the public. Reports glorified bravery and minimized losses. Yet among the admirals, the unspoken acknowledgement persisted. Midway had broken the myth of invincibility. From that point on, Japan was fighting a reactive war, always chasing an enemy who could replace losses faster, adapt quicker and strike harder. By the end of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had recovered ships and men in numbers, but not in spirit. The shadow of Midway shaped every mission, every plan, and every decision. The Empire's greatest admirals had seen the limits of their power, and they knew that the war they had once envisioned as a brilliant stroke of lightning had become a long, grinding fight they were ill-prepared to win. Midway was more than a battle. It was a reckoning. And for the men who had commanded, survived and witnessed its consequences, the lesson was inescapable. The tide had turned, and Japan would never regain the freedom to choose the terms of war again.